In a thunderous climax that has rattled the very foundations of British democracy, the King has dissolved Parliament, plunging Westminster into an unprecedented political maelstrom. This cataclysmic event, dramatized in a viral transcript from Britain Info, represents more than just a temporary institutional crisis. It signals a broader national reckoning over the promises and betrayals of Brexit. The central figure thrust into the spotlight is Nigel Farage, a controversial populist once marginalized by the establishment, now poised as the vanguard of a new political era. The transcript reads like a manifesto of anger and resurgence, painting a bleak picture of betrayal by Keir Starmer, the Labour leader accused of reversing the Brexit mandate through underhanded agreements with the European Union. At the heart of this narrative is the perceived erosion of British sovereignty, the undermining of democratic will, and the resurgence of a populist movement fueled by disillusionment and fury. With the establishment portrayed as collapsing and Farage stepping into a perceived power vacuum, the story encapsulates deep divisions within British society, between elites and ordinary citizens, between those who view Brexit as sacrosanct and those advocating for pragmatic ties with Europe. This narrative invites a critical exploration of power dynamics, manipulation, public sentiment, and the human costs of political grandstanding. In the sections that follow, we will dissect the environment in which this crisis unfolded, the mechanisms of control and narrative warfare at play, the personal and national consequences of policy shifts, and finally, the motivations and implications of a new political voice rising amidst the ruins. The storm that broke over Westminster wasn't sudden. It had been building since the Brexit referendum of 2016, a national vote that delivered a clear mandate: take back control. For many, that vote was sacred. It symbolized sovereignty, identity, and a chance to reclaim what they believed had been lost to the grip of Brussels. But over time, what began as hope steadily morphed into a seething sense of betrayal. While ordinary Britons clung to their vision of independence, a different narrative was quietly taking shape in the corridors of power. Enter Keir Starmer. To the public, he projected calm, control, and moderation. But for the watchers, fishermen, working-class voters, and staunch Brexit supporters, his every move rang alarm bells. When he unveiled what he dubbed the Brexit reset, that alarm became a siren. Agreements were signed, not to fortify Britain's independence, but to dilute it. Our waters, once proudly defended, were handed over again to EU fishing fleets. British sovereignty was bartered for what critics called photo ops in Brussels wine bars. The atmosphere among traditional communities began to change. Once hopeful, they now felt hoodwinked. And while mainstream news spun the narrative as necessary diplomacy, alternative media like Britain Info exploded with viral fury. Their videos, voiceovers pulsing with urgency, tapped into a raw, unfiltered rage. Fishermen interviewed on docks, pensioners in pubs, young workers facing job losses, all told the same story. We were promised freedom. What we got was a lie. Meanwhile, Nigel Farage, once dismissed as a relic of the Brexit campaign, was quietly mobilizing. He appeared at rallies, town halls, and YouTube live streams, hammering the same message. Starmer isn't mending bridges, he's selling out. His words struck chords, especially in towns already hit hard by economic downturns, where EU access meant little compared to the daily struggle of surviving. The media landscape fractured. Britain Info gained millions of views. On social media, hashtags like #Brexit Betrayal trended. Farage's speeches, filled with stark clarity and emotional appeals, were shared far beyond his traditional base. The mainstream was no longer trusted. People turned to voices they felt spoke for them, not down to them. By the time Parliament was dissolved, the environment was a tinderbox. Starmer's team appeared unfazed, but the ground was shifting. a generation of Britons raised on promises of post-Brexit prosperity, watched in horror as access to their resources was once again traded away. They saw not compromise, but capitulation, not leadership, but surrender. And in this storm of discontent, Farage didn't just endure, he surged. The first cracks in the old regime weren't just political. They were emotional, cultural, existential. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about identity, about whether Britain still belonged to its people or to a faceless technocracy overseas. And that question, once whispered in frustration, was now shouted on every live stream, every dock, every pub bench across the nation. This was no longer just about negotiations. It was about control, about who truly held power and who got to decide what Brexit really meant. When Starmer introduced the so-called Brexit reset, it wasn't framed as surrender. It was branded as repair, as progress. But behind the polished language were deals that felt like betrayals. A 12-year lease of British waters to EU fishing fleets. How could that be anything but capitulation? A youth mobility scheme pitched as cultural exchange, but perceived as a backdoor for mass European migration. How is that anything but a reversal of Brexit's core promise? The tools of manipulation weren't new, but they were finely tuned. Language was weaponized. Starmer spoke of mending bridges, but those bridges led only one way, out of British control. Meanwhile, Britain Info pulled no punches. Their broadcasts painted a grim picture. EU judges returning to rule, British industries being sold out, and the pride of the nation auctioned off for a seat at Brussels wine tables. The betrayal was so blatant, so public, that many asked, how could anyone not see it? The answer was psychological control. A fog of respectability cloaked Starmer's actions. The mainstream media played along, softening the blow, presenting capitulation as pragmatism. Starmer was lauded in European capitals, praised in global forums like Davos, places far removed from the fishing towns and working-class estates that bore the brunt of his policies. It was no wonder, then, that Farage's message resonated. He didn't couch his words. He called it what it was, surrender. And the people listened. But this wasn't just a media battle. This was about contracts, threats, and silence. NDAs, backroom deals, and layers of bureaucracy insulated the reset from public scrutiny. Politicians muttered their concerns behind closed doors, but few dared to challenge the tide openly. Even the Tories, once champions of Brexit, fell mute. The sense of abandonment grew. People began to feel powerless, not just economically, but emotionally. They were told to accept a future that looked like the past they had voted to escape. They were asked to swallow narratives that made no sense to their lived reality. And worst of all, they were told that to question this was to be extreme, or worse, unpatriotic. But Farage refused to be silenced. At every step, he countered the elite narrative with unfiltered truths. He gave voice to the fisherman, to the pensioner, to the ordinary Briton who felt erased from national decisions. With each broadcast, each rally, his message sharpened. This isn't just about policy. It's about who we are. It's about the soul of a nation. As the old order crumbled, it became clear that this wasn't a political squabble. It was a systemic failure. The establishment had underestimated the strength of the public's memory and their resolve. The mechanisms of control, legal, psychological, rhetorical, were no match for a nation that had reached its breaking point. The system cracked. And the king, the very symbol of unity, stepped in. Parliament was dissolved. The people would now speak. And as they looked around for someone who hadn't flinched, someone who had warned them all along, they saw Farage, standing firm. The fallout wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. For many across Britain, the consequences of Starmer's Brexit reset weren't just figures on a balance sheet or diplomatic footnotes. They were lived experiences, etched into the daily grind of fishermen losing their livelihoods, workers watching, industries collapse, and pensioners bracing for harsher times. The impact of policies like the extended fishing rights granted to French trawlers until 2037 felt like a cruel joke. Coastal towns, already gasping for economic air, now faced 12 more years of uncertainty. These communities, once the backbone of British independence, had been told to wait while their seas were drained. In pubs, markets, and union halls, the sentiment was clear: betrayal. Voices that once championed change now trembled with disbelief. How could this happen again? Why weren't their votes respected? And how could a man who once promised to uphold their will now hand it over in such brazen deals? The anger wasn't just about the policies, it was about the erasure of trust. This was about being ignored, being lied to, and being used. The mental health toll grew. For many, the despair crept in slowly: job loss, community decline, and the feeling that no one in power cared. Reports of anxiety and depression rose in working-class areas hardest hit by these changes. Young people, once told Brexit would open new doors, now saw only barriers. Workers, once proud of their industry, now lined up at food banks. And fishermen, once icons of British self-reliance, felt like ghosts in their own harbors. While the Labour Party reeled, the media painted a sanitized version of events. They spoke of economic strategy and European alignment. But the people saw it differently. They saw a regime crumbling, MPs defecting, whispers of discontent turning into full-blown panic. Some Labour representatives jumped ship, not out of conscience, but out of survival. They knew the tide had turned. Public protests swelled. Online forums exploded with outrage. The phrase, Brexit betrayal, was no longer a fringe slogan. It had become the rallying cry of a nation scorned. Farage's image, once mocked, now appeared on placards beside fishermen and workers demanding justice. The public sentiment was no longer a simmer. It was a boil. In the midst of this storm, personal stories broke through. A retired fisherman in Cornwall wept on a live broadcast, recalling how Starmer's deal had erased his son's future. A young mother in Hull described how local job programs vanished while foreign workers arrived under new migration rules. These weren't statistics. These were the human costs of political arrogance. Farage, long derided by the mainstream, stepped into the breach. He didn't just talk policy. He spoke pain. He acknowledged the broken promises, the dashed hopes, the cold bureaucratic logic that had ravaged communities. And as he stood on stages across the country, his voice wasn't just one of defiance. It was one of resonance. This was more than political fallout. It was a spiritual rupture. A belief that the system was supposed to protect them, shattered. A trust that elections mattered, corroded. And in that void, Farage didn't just offer answers, he offered recognition. In the absence of care, he gave voice. In the wreckage of political decorum, he pointed to the raw truth. As Westminster unraveled and traditional leaders scrambled, a new narrative solidified. The establishment had failed, and Farage had not. The fishing boats that once sailed proudly under the Union Jack now drifted in uncertainty, but their anger had found direction, their voice had found a platform, and their future, though uncertain, was no longer silent. In the storm that engulfed Westminster, what began as a political crisis ended as a national awakening. The King's dissolution of Parliament didn't just shut down a failed system, it signaled a new chapter. One written not by bureaucrats in Brussels or technocrats in Davos, but by the people of Britain. And at the center of this chapter was the story of betrayal, resistance, and revival. Nigel Farage, once an outlier, emerged as the unlikely protagonist in a tale of failed promises and reclaimed power. His defiance, mocked for years, became a mirror for the nation's frustration and a beacon for its resolve. As millions rallied to his message, what once seemed fringe became mainstream. What once felt impossible, political change at the highest levels, now seemed inevitable. But the real story isn't about Farage alone. It's about the millions who refused to stay silent, the fishermen who stood their ground, the workers who spoke out, the families who said enough. Their voices ignored for years finally broke through, and their message was unmistakable. We were lied to, but we won't be lied to again. The collapse of the old order wasn't just about policy failure, it was about moral failure. A system built on spin, concealment, and compromise could no longer survive the weight of its own contradictions. In its place, a new demand had risen for transparency, for sovereignty, for justice. The people weren't asking for perfection, they were demanding truth. And that demand couldn't be silenced. Looking forward, the challenge isn't just about winning elections, it's about rebuilding trust. Restoring belief that government can serve the people, not rule over them. Reform UK now carries that burden. And as the nation prepares to decide again, the stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just about Brexit anymore. It's about what kind of country Britain wants to be. If the past few years have shown anything, it's that the British spirit is resilient. Betrayal may wound, but it also awakens. And now, with the ashes of betrayal still warm, a new fire has been lit. One fueled by truth, carried by courage, and aimed at a future that finally feels like it belongs to the people. The king has spoken, the old system has fallen, and now the people will choose. Not just a leader, but a path. Not just a party, but a principle. And in that choice lies the hope of a new Britain, bold, sovereign, and unafraid. So now you've seen it, how a nation's promise was hijacked, how the people were betrayed, and how one man stood his ground. This isn't just a political shift. It's a warning to every voter, everywhere. If you don't protect your voice, someone else will use it against you. If this made you feel something, anger, hope, fire, don't let it stop here. Hit that like button. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed, because this story is only getting started. Share this video with someone who still believes truth matters. Together, let's wake the world up.